In a way, our current economic model has brought loads of benefits, not least has taken millions of people out of poverty and provide prosperity, across the world. But it has also come at a cost mainly around the environmental externalities that have not been integrated.
Welcome to Sustainability Leaders. I'm Michael Torrance, Chief Sustainability Officer at BMO. On this show, we will talk with leading sustainability practitioners from the corporate, investor, academic, and NGO communities to explore how this rapidly evolving field of sustainability is impacting global investment, business practices, and our world.
The views expressed here are those of the participants and not those of Bank of Montreal, its affiliates, or subsidiaries.
Today's episode focuses on the intersection of sustainability, policy, and finance. My guest is Helena Viñes Fiestas, who is chair of the EU Platform on Sustainable Finance, co-chair of the Taskforce on Net Zero Policy, and commissioner of the Spanish Financial Markets Authority. Helena has 2 decades of experience in responsible business and investment. We're thrilled to learn from her global perspective on sustainable finance issues in the EU and around the world. Welcome, Helena, and thank you for joining me today.
Thank you for inviting me. It's a real pleasure to be with you today.
Can you please describe for our audience the work that you do for the European Union on sustainability and sustainable finance? What is your mandate?
So the European Union established the platform, what we call the EU Platform Sustainable Finance. And the number one goal of the platform is to advise. It's a multi-stakeholder advisory group to the European Commission when it comes to the development of the taxonomy, but also the different pieces of this big jigsaw that we call the Sustainable Finance Framework. And we have already run through 2 mandates, and the last mandate, our number one goal was to make the taxonomy more workable. In a way, you need to think of the Sustainable Finance Framework as I was saying, a big jigsaw where the centerpiece is the taxonomy. And all these different pieces of the jigsaw have been designed to fit. But what happened is that they were negotiated and developed separately. So now that the building blocks of the different pieces have been adopted and have been started being implemented, we are now bringing them back together. And they not always fit together, if you know. So now we need to polish them. So that was our key mandate of the last platform that finished at the end of March.
Let's start by giving our listeners a sense of your journey and the leadership role that you're playing around the topic of sustainable finance in the European Union. Just in terms of your background, why did you decide to focus in this area, sustainable finance, as part of your career?
Actually, I started when I finished my master's. I realized that the financial sector was, in many aspects, the key to a change of our economic model. In a way, our current economic model has brought loads of benefits, not least has taken millions of people out of poverty and provide prosperity, across the world. But it has also come at a cost mainly around the environmental externalities that have not been integrated. And for me, it became quite obvious that if we wanted the different sectors of the economy to start taking into account or considering those environmental externalities, we needed to get the financial sector on board. The financial sector is almost like a double-edged sword. On one hand, it is the real driver. It can be a real force for good. And at the same time, it also poses some hurdles to that for progressing towards a more sustainable economy, not least because of the shortism. So it seemed to me that getting the sustainable finance on board was critical.
So you've mentioned sustainable finance taxonomy. Can you just provide a little bit more background as to what that instrument is and why was it needed? What purpose is it serving now?
Yes. So the taxonomy is a little bit like a dictionary that tells you which economic activities can be deemed sustainable and under which circumstances. And in order to do so, it defines technical criteria that when the different economic activities, when they're conducted meeting those criteria, then they can be considered sustainable. The idea is for the taxonomy to be the reference point in defining what is sustainable. And for the audience to understand it better, I like to compare it with food products. So there's at least in Europe, there's no obligation when it comes to you need to invest in A or B. But if you market your financial instrument, your financial product as green or sustainable, then it's only fair to ask, what is that percentage of sustainability of the product? And because the majority of people don't really know all the technical details, then we have the taxonomy as the reference point. A little bit like with products, with food products. Imagine, for example, a yogurt. The majority of us, we don't know whether or not 20 grams, is too much. 20 grams of fat is too much or too little. So if that yogurt is commercialized as low fat, for example, then what is required is to disclose how much fat it has. And because the majority of us, as we were saying, we don't know whether 20 or 25 grams is too much, then we have the reference point, which is the recommended daily intake. So the taxonomy, in a way, operates as the recommended daily intake, but when it comes to sustainability and for financial products. Now, it also, at least in Europe, it also works to define the percentage of sustainability of a company's activities, because companies in Europe have to report what is the percentage of their revenue generated from economic activities that are aligned with the taxonomy. And I will finish by saying the taxonomy, in a way, has created for the very first time a bridge between environmental performance and financial performance, because it captures environmental performance through financial metrics.
Can you provide a little bit more detail about the contents of the taxonomy? So what types of activities qualify on the environmental side, and are there any non-environmental categories within the taxonomy?
So the taxonomy covers 6 environmental objectives. So climate mitigation, climate adaptation or resilience, then water and marine resources, pollution, and by pollution we mean from soil, water, and air pollution. You also have biodiversity and ecosystems, and last but not least, circular economy. In Europe, each one of the environmental objectives is subject to a strategy with the specific targets. So, for example, mitigation, it's net zero, reach climate neutrality by 2050, but we also have a specific targets by 2030, and the targets for 2040 are being negotiated. So when we develop the taxonomy for mitigation, we first we look at what it should be, that economy at 2050. And we recognize there were 3 types of different economic activities. First, those who were almost net zero, low carbon. These are, for example, solar, wind energy, electric vehicles. So these are economic activities that they are almost there, or if they're not already there. Then we have what we call the enabling activities. These are the technologies and services and products that will help the rest of the economy and society to reach carbon neutrality. And they tend to be part of the value chain. So, for example, you will find the batteries for electric vehicles. You will find the wind turbines for wind power generations, and so forth. And then Finally, we have what we call the transition activities. And these are really important because the transition activities are those activities that they are considered essential for the economy, for which there's no replacement, which is lower carbon. And on those activities, we call them in transition because they're far from having reached net zero. And what the taxonomy will do is identify the best practice, that is economically and technological feasible. Now, to respond to your question, the activities that you will not find in the taxonomy are twofold. On one hand, those activities for which there's no economically or technological solution, and they have a lower carbon alternative. So, for example, coal power generation. Coal power generation is not part of the taxonomy. That activity is considered that will have no place in net zero economy. Now, the other type of activities that we will find there are those activities that really their decarbonization is not linked to the activity per se, but through other activities. So let's imagine, for example, consulting or marketing. The marketing per se, a firm that whose main activity is marketing, if they want to reach net zero, it has to do with renovating the building in which their offices are, on using electric vehicles, but it's not around changing the activity per se, which in this case would be marketing, which you can be marketing about plenty of things.
So the criteria of the sustainable finance taxonomy must be met for finance to be labeled as sustainable. And that, you said, there has a consumer protection aspect to that what is being claimed meets certain guardrails. What's the benefit for the labeling entity, whether it's a financial institution or whomever, to want to label their finance activity as sustainable? Is there a perceived market or other benefit that they obtain?
So the taxonomy really labels what it can be considered, sustainable green. And all the financial products, these are like portfolios, funds that are marketed as having a sustainable investment objective or having environmental characteristics. In Europe today, 62% of the entire market is ESG. So it has environmental, social, or governance characteristics. What we have perceived is that those companies that have exhibit a relatively good taxonomy alignment percentage, whether we were talking about revenues or CapEx, have been performing better financially. It ought to be said, though, that one of the areas that still needs quite a lot of progress in relation of using the taxonomy for creating or constructing the portfolios. And the majority of investors, and we have interviewed investors across Europe, find the taxonomy really useful for them to understand what can be considered green or sustainable or not, but also as a great indicator for the credibility of companies' transition plans and transition claims. This is particularly what they most appreciate is the disclosure of CapEx alignment with the taxonomy, because it tells you, as I was saying, the direction of travel of a company. And in a way, it's almost like, tell me where you put your money. So investors have been telling us, look, really useful for understanding what's sustainable, really useful for appreciating, companies' efforts to really give that credibility to the transition plans. But we cannot use the taxonomy to construct our portfolios because we only have information from the largest companies within Europe, and more than 70% or even more of European portfolios, financial products include issuers from all over the world, right? Or non-European or European, but they're not mandated to disclose taxonomy alignment. So that is one of the problems from using the taxonomy. The European Commission, though, explained that investors can use estimates And we've seen data providers improving more on their estimations of taxonomy alignment. Yeah. And investors can use that. All they need is to, be transparent about the percentage that might be, estimated, but still very early days for that. So the taxonomy could also be seen as a great tool for adjusting and informing policy measures. And in a context of real constraints when it comes to public funding, this is extremely useful to really target that funding to support those technologies that are really needed, but they are being underinvested, by the private sector.
And so that speaks to how this taxonomy is part of a much broader policy objective, particularly around decarbonization and net zero. One of the roles that you are currently leading is the recently formed Taskforce on Net Zero Policy. Can you speak to the mission of that task force and what work you're doing now to achieve that policy objective?
Absolutely. A little bit more than 3 years ago, the UN Secretary General created a high-level expert group that I was part of, whose mandate was to develop a set of criteria to help to assess the credibility of corporate and financial institutions' transition plans. That work led to a benchmark with 10 specific recommendations. And the last of those recommendations was basically saying, that if we really want to achieve net zero by 2050, as science is telling us, we need to really speed up, and the governments need to take full responsibility and start developing, efficient policy frameworks that support companies and financial institutions to transition to net zero. As part also of that recommendation, we recommended to create a task force on net zero policy that will, help policymakers, that will create a safe space for policymakers of different geographies, of different areas of policy, come together and share their experiences in developing policy. To that end, I personally launched the Task Force on Net Zero Policy on our board seats, some of the most important international organizations. The number one area that has been developed is disclosures. There's no surprise there, but it is important to note that disclosures now also include, mandatory recommended disclosures, that they are forward-looking, and in many occasions they also include criteria for how those disclosures should be conducted. Of course, with ISSB standards now, the adoption of climate-related disclosures is being spread, across many geographies, particularly within the G20. Now, on transition plans or transition planning, we see that there are 8 of the G20 countries. And by the way, when we talk about G20 countries, we excluded the EU for counting the number of countries, because already we had France, Germany, and Italy, as a representation. So 8 countries have developed or have some type of requirements on transition plans, being the EU the only one that is made it mandatory. And then we have taxonomies, and we were talking about taxonomies. And at the time of the report, we have accounted 50 taxonomies in the making, but now, a few months later, we can already account for 60 taxonomies in the making across the world, which basically would mean that 65% of the global GDP will be covered by a taxonomy.
And you've mentioned that this overarching policy framework includes sustainability disclosure expectations. If we focus on that for a moment, what can you tell our audience about the EU's approach to sustainability disclosure? And also, I'm sure on many people's minds will be the interaction of that framework and set of requirements with the ISSB, which you've also mentioned a couple of times as being one of the main drivers for enhanced sustainability disclosure globally.
It's a really interesting history, right, of the development of climate disclosures. I don't know if the audience recalls the G20 Commission, the FSB chair at the time, Mark Carney, to develop some voluntary financial climate disclosures. And that was the Taskforce on Climate-Related Disclosures. And that framework became a real reference point. So we work in Europe on how to integrate it and take it further, and how to integrate it in our already existing sustainability reporting framework. And that was the main input for the models on climate for the CSRD that you just mentioned. Well, that work was a real inspiration for the ISSB in turn. So they were already quite strongly linked, both frameworks. I guess the main difference is that the European one covered all environmental objectives, plus social aspects, plus governance. And it also included disclosures that were mandatory in Europe already because of other regulations. Now, I would also say that the European standards included specific criteria. So just to give an example, the ESRS are very specific on the use of offsets, for example. So they need to be disclosed separately. You need to disclose, how do you ensure that they are high integrity, they cannot account for the achievement of interim targets and so forth. Something that the ISSB, which is normal, it's a little bit more neutral. The ISSB, it's an international standard. So therefore, it cannot be as ambitious, if you wish. So in my perspective, the two complemented each other really well. The ISSB being the international reference, and the ESRS, in a way, being more ambitious, sort of paving the way on what the direction of travel should be.
Great. Well, thank you so much for your time, Helena, and sharing your insights in this very exciting and rapidly changing area of sustainability.
You're more than welcome. It's been a real pleasure.
Thanks for listening to Sustainability Leaders. This podcast is presented by BMO. You can find our show on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or your favorite podcast player. Press the follow button if you want to get notified when new episodes are published. We value your input, so please leave a rating, review, and any feedback that you might have, or visit us at bmo.com/sustainability leaders. Our show and resources are produced with support from BMO's marketing team and Puddle Creative. Until next time, thanks for listening, and have a great week.
For BMO disclosures, please visit bmocm.com/podcast/disclaimer.